Well, hello, and welcome back. I'm A.J. O'Neill, and I will be your instructor for tonight's Beyond Code Live. Now, because I'm actually out at my grandma's house today, we are going to be doing, and I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to do the setup while I'm out visiting family. We're just going to do a little open source success story today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about filepathx and how I added, made a pull request for it and got it added to the project. So filepathx isn't super particularly important for the general concept of what we're going over here, but it is a file path library for Golang. I program in a lot of Go. We've talked about this. And what we had was this person had put on Stack Overflow. Let me see if I can find the original post now. I thought that I had that up here. Sorry about that. Nope, that's not the one. Go back here. Go back here. Basically, they had answered a question on Stack Overflow. Is it down here? No, it's not. Well, I can't show you because I don't have a link to it. But they'd answered a question on Stack Overflow. And because the code was a little bit longer than what's typical that you would post in Stack Overflow, typically on Stack Overflow, you only post code if it's a, maybe 15 lines long or so. It was a little bit longer than that. So they didn't post on Stack Overflow. What they did instead was they created a repository on GitHub, and I'll show you what the code looks like, just so you can kind of see about how long it is. So it's about 60 lines long, so a little bit longer than what you'd post on Stack Overflow. And this person did not include a license with the code. When you post code on Stack Overflow, there's a default open source license that basically just says the only thing that you need to do is link back to the Stack Overflow article from which you took the code. And he didn't have a license. The code was separate, so technically it's in an ambiguous legal area. Obviously, he meant for the code to be open source because he gave an answer to somebody's question and then gave a link to the code. But this code, I don't know how old it was. Let's see what the history was on this. It was about 4 years old when I came across it. And it also didn't have any example of how to use it. And it also, the documentation for it, although there is documentation in the code, and documentation can be generated from the code. You see there's a bunch of comments here. These comments actually represent proper Go doc. But before, there was an error message instead of documentation on the automatic documentation page because there was no license. And so the Go documentation page, if there's no license, it says, hey, we can't show you the documentation because we don't know what we're allowed to show or not allowed to show. In any case, what I did was I took the example that he had given on Stack Overflow. We can take a look at the commits here, and let's take a look at the files in the commits. There we go. So basically this was the example that he had posted on Stack Overflow of how to use it, or something similar to that. And so I took the usage example, I put it into an examples folder, and I added a README that shows you how to use it. And it took a long time before this was added. So let's go back to my commit for this was September 18th, 2020. Right now it is May 6th, 2021. So 3/4 of a year or so. But what I try to do, and I want to show you how to make it more likely that you'll have success with your commits. What I try to do, if we go back here to my pull request, is give people exactly the information they need to be able to do what I'm asking them to do. So I said, here's what I did. I added a README, I added a license, I told them the reasons that I did it, I added a go.mod so that it would be compatible with the latest version of Go, and I added an example. And you see I got some thumbs up from some other people that were interested in seeing this getting merged in. And then I said, also, you'll need to tag this. Now, if he just wanted to merge this in, all he would have to do is click a merge button, which eventually he did. Either he merged it in by clicking the merge button, or he merged it in by using the get command line. But what he wouldn't have been able to do with just a button press is to be able to tag it with a version number. And Go uses get versions. So if you tag something with a version in Go, then when you push those tags, that is the version that the Go module system will read from. So I gave him exactly the commands that he needed in order to be able to accomplish that, so that he didn't have to think about it or remember it in case he wasn't used to doing that on a regular basis. Now, the next thing is that after, well, I guess about 9 months, so I saw an email where somebody else was making a pull request and for a potential bug fix. And so it reminded me of this, and I went back and I just sent him another message. And I used the @ symbol with his name so that it would definitely tag him and that he would get this message in email. Could you take a quick look at this? Again, lowering the barrier to entry so that it's a little bit easier for him to make a decision. Do I do something with this? Do I not do something with this? So take a quick look. There are no code changes, just adding documentation and a license. And then, boom, the next day he merges it in. So I probably could have bugged him about that, maybe 6 months ago or 3 months ago or a week after I put this in. He was probably busy. He's got work stuff. Who knows what he's got going on? He ain't got no time for some stupid open source Stack Overflow question that he answered, But for me, it really was important that we get a license in there, and just in general, it's nice to have a README. So anyway, he merged in the contribution, and then I like to tell people what I do things, why I do them, and what the problem solution is, and a link if necessary. So one of the problems that I mentioned was that we couldn't get the documentation on package.go.dev. It wasn't being generated because there wasn't a license there. So I go and I check, all right, does it work? Can we now get the documentation here? And at first we couldn't. It still gave this documentation is not available. So I did a little bit of Googling. I went and found, eventually landed on go.dev/about, where it talks about how to add a package and the different ways you can do that. And so I just kind of regurgitated that information here, saying, as per the documentation I read, I went to the proxy site with the exact URL, which is one of the things that it says to do. And I also ran the go proxy command with the appropriate version. So hopefully this will get updated in the next cycle, because that documentation page gets regenerated every once in a while. So I made sure that if somebody else is coming across this, maybe they're Googling, and because all the time you Google and you come to some issue on GitHub that maybe is solved, maybe isn't solved, and sometimes the person doesn't say how they solved it, right? So I like to leave breadcrumbs, and also I might forget that the documentation is right here on the go.dev about page. I might remember that I did it for filepathx. So it's good as breadcrumbs for myself as well as for other people, just to show, here's the problem that I wanted to solve, have the documentation automatically update, here's what I did to solve it. And then I went back and I updated when I saw that the solution was indeed verified, that I can now get to the documentation on filepathx. So I've talked about this on the Health Wealth Commitment channel. Don't give more than you are willing to lose. Open source is a big risk. Most of the time, the maintainers are no longer maintaining that project, or it was just a dinky weekend thing that they didn't intend for it to evolve and become involved. And they don't intend to continue to be involved. So always, I think that it's really, really important that when you make a change to somebody's project, you don't just make it locally in your own folder, because eventually you're going to shoot yourself in the foot that way. You should make a PR. If you need to fork it, fine, but you should make a PR when your changes are a bug fix or something that applies broadly and not too niche to your specific use case. And you have to keep in mind not to be too upset if they never get back to you, because out of maybe 50% of the pull requests that I make that are similar in nature to this get pulled in. There have been pull requests that I've done on a couple of bigger projects, which I really got upset about, because the worst thing that can happen is not to make a PR and get no response. The worst thing that can happen is when you make a pull request and the author engages you and says, hey, this is good, except will you change X? And you go and change X, and then they come back and they say, actually, I forgot that Y is coming down the pipeline, so could you make sure that it works nicely with Y? And then you go ahead and make that change. And then they say, oh, actually, we also are making sure that all the new pull requests have tests. So can you add a test to this? And you have to go learn their specific testing framework for their particular project. And sometimes it's just as easy as copy and paste. Anyway, and so it goes on and on and on. And after your whole weekend, or 3 days out of the week where you've ended up spending 6 extra hours into these little nitpicky changes, then they never get back to you. That's the worst case. The worst case is when they engage you and ask you to do a ton of work that you weren't intending to do and wasn't really relevant to solving the immediate problem at hand, and then just drop it. And I've had that happen a couple times too. So even when you feel like you're making progress and you think that things are going well, always keep in mind, don't invest more time than you're willing